The air in the bank was thick, like the kind of tension that makes your skin itch, the kind you can feel crawling up your spine before something big goes down. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, just another day at the First National Savings on Maple Street. Or at least it was supposed to be. Then, the door swung open. In walked a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a faded hoodie and a cap low over his brow. His presence was commanding, like he didn't need to say a word, and yet the whole room went still. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to fade, and the sound of the busy street outside softened, replaced by the unmistakable murmur of a crowd gathering inside. He made his way to the teller, calm but determined. The kind of guy who had nothing to prove but still somehow knew the whole room was watching. "Can I help you, sir?" The teller, a young woman with tight curls and bright red lipstick, barely glanced up. She'd seen him before, plenty of times probably. But today was different. "I need to open an account," he said, his voice steady, but there was a weight to it that carried through. Everyone could feel it, the same way you can feel the storm coming before the first raindrop falls. But then, just as he stepped forward, she froze. "Sorry, sir," she said, almost too quickly. Her words felt rehearsed, robotic. "We can't let you open an account today." The room went silent and the air felt heavy, thick enough to choke you. Everyone could see what was happening, but no one said a word. The man stood there, his hands at his sides, fists clenched just a little tighter, the muscles in his jaw twitching. The woman repeated herself, her tone colder now. "You're not allowed in here." That's when he smiled. A slow, knowing smile, the kind that didn't belong in that moment. Without a single word, he turned and walked out of the bank. But as he did, the world seemed to pause. The ground beneath them all shifted. 2 months later, the same man, the one they'd tried to bar, stood at the head of the very same bank. The door to the First National Savings was open, but it wasn't just a door anymore. It was the gateway to something much bigger, because that man wasn't just a customer anymore. He was the owner, and the people who had refused him. They were now working for him. You think you know how this story ends? Trust me, you don't. Stay tuned. Setup: Marcus Big Mac. Johnson wasn't the type of guy you'd expect to catch on the wrong side of a bank line. He was the kind of dude who could walk into any room and fill it with his presence. No arrogance, just pure confidence. A 33-year-old from Atlanta, he carried his roots in his chest, beaten steady like the drum of his hometown. His hands, rough from years of manual labor, had seen more hard work than most folks could ever imagine. He wasn't rich, but his hustle, that was something else. He'd spent the last decade bouncing from job to job, trying to build something better for himself. It wasn't easy, especially not for a black man in America, but he'd made it through worse. Lately, though, life was feeling a little off. There was something about the way people looked at him these days, something just a little too obvious. And it wasn't just at work, it was everywhere. Like that time at the corner store last week. He had stepped in to grab a bag of chips, right? But as he reached for the Doritos, the cashier, this old white dude, maybe in his 50s, glanced up, then quickly looked back down at the register, practically double-checking the price of the chips, like Marcus had done something wrong just by standing there. That uncomfortable hesitation, the one that feels like someone's scanning you, putting your life on pause just to figure out if you belong, that was becoming the norm. It wasn't like Marcus didn't see it coming. He'd always known the score. Growing up in Atlanta, you learn real quick how to navigate spaces that weren't designed for you, how to keep your head low and your mouth shut, especially when you're walking into places where people don't expect to see you, like banks. He'd heard it all before, heard the whispers, the sideways glances, the "why you here?" energy that always followed him, but he never thought it'd be a problem at the bank. Hell, a bank should be a place where everyone gets treated the same, right? But Marcus knew better than anyone that in this country, that wasn't always the case. The day he walked into First National Savings, he wasn't expecting anything special. He wasn't looking for drama, wasn't out here trying to prove anything to anybody. He just wanted to open an account. After all, he had recently landed a new gig at a construction firm, making decent money for the first time in a while. He had plans to buy a house one day, something for his kids, a future that felt more stable than the life he'd known. And for that, he needed a bank, a regular, no-big-deal bank. Marcus had spent years living paycheck to paycheck, always keeping his savings in cash, stashing it in an old cigar box under his bed. But this new job, the better pay, it felt like the start of something. And the first step, walking into a real bank like the ones on the commercials, the ones that looked so shiny and clean on TV. As he approached the counter, he noticed a few people eyeing him. One older man, probably in his 60s, had this look on his face. The kind of look you get when you're trying to figure out if you know someone, but you're too proud to ask. It wasn't obvious, but Marcus felt it. That quiet, unspoken tension that never seemed to leave the air when he walked into places like this. You know, the places where you're not really supposed to be. And then the teller, the young white woman, no older than 25, smiled at him, but it didn't feel like the kind of smile you get when you're dealing with a regular customer. It felt forced, polite, like she was trying too hard to convince herself she was doing her job right. She didn't look up from her screen as she asked, "How can I help you today?" "I'd like to open an account," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm. He tried to keep the weirdness out of his tone, but something in the way she stared at the computer screen made him feel like he didn't belong. It was subtle at first, like maybe she was just focused on the task. But Marcus knew better than to ignore that feeling. You get that gut check when you've been black in America long enough. And that gut check told him this wasn't going to be easy. She paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then finally she looked up, her eyes barely meeting his. "I'm afraid I can't open an account for you today." Marcus blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me? You need to have a certain amount to start, sir," she said, still not looking directly at him. "Our policy." Marcus raised an eyebrow. The policy? He'd done his homework. He knew exactly what the minimum deposit was. He had that and more. "I've got the money. I'm just trying to open an account." The woman's lips pressed together in that tight, rehearsed way. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't do that for you today." It wasn't until she said that, right there in front of everyone, that Marcus realized something he had suspected but never fully confronted. They weren't treating him like a customer. They were treating him like a problem. "Is there something wrong with me being here?" Marcus asked, his voice low but cutting through the air like a knife. The young teller froze, her expression shifting, like she didn't know how to respond. The whole room felt like it was holding its breath. I'm sorry, sir. I just can't help you today." That's when it hit him. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the deposit.
It was about him, being a black man in a space where he didn't belong. In their eyes, he was the wrong type of customer.
He didn't fit the mold. Marcus stood there for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in. Then he turned and walked out. As he stepped through the door, he could feel the eyes on him, the stares that followed. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment that would change everything. The next morning, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bank's website on his phone. He had an idea, one that was growing faster than he could keep up with. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about making them see him, see people like him, in a way they couldn't ignore. Maybe the way to fix it wasn't to keep trying to fit into their world. Maybe the way to fix it was to buy it. Rising Action, Part 1. The weeks after Marcus's encounter at First National Savings felt like the weight of the world was settling on his shoulders. At first he thought it was just one bad day, but the more he replayed that moment in his head, the more it started to eat at him. The more it festered like a wound that wouldn't heal. See, Marcus was no stranger to struggle. He'd grown up in the kind of neighborhoods where the police came by more than they should, and where opportunities weren't handed out, especially to people who looked like him. In Atlanta, they didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat for black folks who wanted to climb the economic ladder. But Marcus had always believed that hard work could break down walls, that if you showed up and put in the time, you could earn your place. He had that drive. It was in his blood. But what happened at the bank, that wasn't just a bad day. It was something deeper, something systemic. And the more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was everywhere. He had his car parked on the outskirts of the city now, right by a little strip mall. Every morning, he'd walk past the same businesses, fast food joints, laundromats, a couple of mom-and-pop shops. Nothing flashy, just working-class folks making do. But something about this morning was different. It wasn't even 9 a.m., but already the energy in the air felt thick. That's when Marcus spotted it. There was a man. There was a man, an older white guy in a suit. walking out of one of the shops and making his way toward his car. The guy gave Marcus a once-over, like he was trying to make sure he wasn't up to anything. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't the first time. Marcus had caught that look before. A glance followed by a double take, like Marcus was some kind of threat just by existing. "Damn, man," Marcus muttered under his breath, his hands in his hoodie pockets as he kept walking. The man's eyes never left him, not until he got into his car and drove off. It wasn't the first time Marcus had been treated like this. That look, quick, judgmental, full of assumptions, was something he'd gotten used to, especially in places like this. It was the kind of microaggression you could never really prove, but you felt it in your bones. It was the type of thing you'd find yourself wondering if it was your imagination, if you were just being paranoid. But deep down, you knew it wasn't. You knew it was the world telling you that you didn't belong. The thing that stung the most wasn't that one moment, though. No, it was the way it added up, the way these little everyday encounters piled on top of each other, like bricks on a wall, slowly building something you couldn't escape. That day, as Marcus walked to his car, he saw the "For Rent" sign hanging on the front of a building on the corner. It was a small office space, perfect for a little hustle. He'd always been the type to dream big. Maybe this could be his chance. He'd been working construction for years, but that wasn't his real dream. He had bigger plans, bigger goals. He'd been thinking about starting a business, opening something that would give him real ownership. But the thought of starting his own thing, that felt impossible sometimes. The last few months had been hard. He'd applied for loans, tried to get financing, but every time, it was the same story. "Sorry, sir, your credit score doesn't meet our standards." Or, "We can't offer that kind of support right now." His credit score wasn't the best, sure, but wasn't it the same for a lot of people trying to climb out of the trenches? He wasn't lazy. He worked his ass off every damn day. But for some reason, no matter how hard he tried, it was like there was always something just a little out of reach, something that didn't feel fair. That's when he got the idea. If he couldn't get a loan through the system, maybe the system needed a shakeup. Maybe it wasn't about playing by the rules they set. Maybe it was about making new ones. As Marcus sat in his car staring out at the "For Rent" sign, the thought hit him like a lightning bolt. Why not buy the bank? He chuckled to himself at first. It seemed insane, but it also felt like the kind of crazy that might just work. If he couldn't get a loan to start his own business, why not flip the script? He could buy into the system, own it. Then he wouldn't have to fight the bias, the microaggressions, the constant feeling of being watched and judged. He could create a space that wasn't built to exclude people like him. He could finally show everyone what it meant to have real ownership. But it wasn't going to be easy. Marcus wasn't some big-time investor. He didn't have millions just lying around waiting to be spent. Hell, he didn't even have the connections to pull off something like that. But Marcus had learned a long time ago how to survive on his own terms. If there was one thing he'd learned growing up in the streets of Atlanta, it was this. You can't always play by their rules, but you can sure as hell learn how to make your own. A week passed, and Marcus dove headfirst into the research. He pulled up everything he could find on the bank. Its history, its financials, its board of directors. He learned about its mergers, its acquisitions, its partnerships. It wasn't just about understanding how the bank worked. It was about understanding how the whole damn system worked. He even went as far as finding out who owned the property. After hours of digging, he found a name he recognized. George Holloway, a businessman with deep pockets and connections all over the city. Holloway had been around for years, and Marcus knew he was exactly the kind of person who owned a piece of the bank, a part of the machine that ran everything. Marcus wasn't sure how he was going to pull it off, but he had to try. He started putting together a plan. He was going to need a lot more than just paperwork to buy a bank. He'd need capital, sure. But he'd also need leverage. He'd need something that would make George Holloway and the rest of the board sit up and pay attention. Something that would make them realize they couldn't just shut him out. The first step was simple. He needed money. Not a loan. He'd been down that road before. He was going to have to get creative. Marcus spent nights making calls, meeting with old friends who had some pull. He reached out to his cousins, aunts, uncles, anyone who might be able to help. Slowly but surely, he started to piece things together. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to happen. He could feel it in his gut. But as Marcus worked, the world kept moving against him. Everywhere he went, it felt like doors were being slammed shut in his face. At work, the supervisors never seemed to notice when he did the heavy lifting. They always seemed to pick someone else for the big projects, the guys with connections, the guys who looked the part. And when it came time to talk promotions, the answer was always the same. Maybe next year. It was the little things that stung the most, like the way the office manager would always ask him to grab the coffee for the team, or how the senior partners would sidestep him in the hallway, never making eye contact. But Marcus didn't back down. He couldn't, because if he let the small things beat him, then what was the point of the big dream? He was going to show them all. It wasn't just about a bank. It was about proving that people like him, people who fought every day just to get by, could own it all. And when he did, no one would ever look at him the same way again. As Marcus set his sights on the goal, the road ahead felt longer than he could have ever imagined. The fight was just beginning. Rising Action. Part 2. Marcus's life was starting to feel like it was on the edge of something big, but not in a way that made him feel comfortable. Every step he took towards his goal, owning that bank, felt like he was walking a tightrope, stretched between two worlds. One was the world of dreams, where anything was possible with the right grit and hustle. The other was the world of reality, where people like him were never quite allowed to be seen as equals. It was like fighting an invisible enemy, something always pushing back, even when you didn't see it coming. The weight of it all started to show in the way Marcus carried himself. He wasn't getting any younger, and the streets had a way of aging you faster than you realized. But still, he kept his head down, kept pushing. He had to. There were people who were counting on him, people like his mother, who'd always dreamed of a better life for her kids, and his younger brother Tyrell, who was still out there trying to figure out how to survive in a world that kept trying to swallow him whole. Tyrell was a handful. He had always been the one to get into trouble, never listening to Marcus's advice. Marcus had taken the role of the older brother seriously, but it wasn't easy when Tyrell refused to stay out of the streets. The last time they spoke, Marcus had tried to talk sense into him, telling him to stay away from the gangs, that the streets weren't going to take him anywhere. But Tyrell wasn't having it. "You just don't get it, man," Tyrell had said, his voice full of frustration. "You act like the system's gonna help you if you just keep playing by their rules. But it ain't like that. You ain't gonna get ahead unless you fight back." The words stung. They hit too close to home. Marcus had spent his whole life trying to play by the rules. He'd tried to earn his place the hard way, but was Tyrell right? Was it all just a game that Marcus had never truly been a part of? In the middle of this struggle, a name kept popping up in Marcus's research: George Holloway, the man who owned a good chunk of First National savings. Holloway wasn't just some businessman. He was a part of the old money class, a man who didn't just profit from the system. He was the system. Holloway had been around for decades, pulling strings behind the scenes, influencing politicians, funding campaigns, sitting on boards, and hosting the kind of parties that Marcus could only dream of getting invited to. To Marcus, Holloway was the embodiment of everything that kept people like him from getting ahead. Holloway was the wall that every black man and woman in America kept running into, no matter how hard they tried to break through. Holloway represented the wealthy elite who didn't have to play by the same rules as the rest of the country. And now, it felt like Marcus was about to go head-to-head with him. But getting to Holloway wasn't going to be easy. He had power, influence, and a team of well-paid lawyers who made sure his name stayed clean. The kind of men who could cover up any mess before anyone even noticed it. The kind of men who made it their job to keep the system running smoothly, even if it meant stepping on a few necks along the way. Marcus had to get smarter. He couldn't just go in guns blazing. He needed allies, and he needed to understand the system better than anyone else. So he kept digging, looking for cracks in the armor of the people who ran things. He started talking to people who had been in the game longer than him, people who knew how the system worked, how Holloway's wealth had been built. He made a deal with a real estate agent who had connections to people in the banking world. The agent's name was Alicia, and she had been around long enough to know that when you made enemies with the wrong people, the consequences could be brutal. Alicia was a straight shooter. She wasn't someone who pulled punches, which was exactly what Marcus needed. When he told her his plan to buy into First National Savings, she didn't laugh or call him crazy. Instead, she looked him in the eye, nodding slowly. "You want to go up against Holloway? You better be ready to go to war," she warned him. "This ain't no game. He's got more power than you think. If you really want to buy in, you're going to need more than just money. You're going to need leverage. You need to get something on him, something he can't deny." Marcus hadn't expected it to be easy, but he hadn't realized how deep the web of corruption ran. Alicia gave him a few names: business partners, disgruntled former employees, even a couple of politicians who had taken money under the table from Holloway. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was the first taste of the kind of power Holloway had been operating with for years. The kind of power that made you untouchable, no matter what you did. But even as Marcus started piecing this together, he realized there was more at play than just Holloway. There were people who made sure the system stayed the way it was. People who made sure that black folks like Marcus never got to the top. It wasn't just about the bank. It was about the whole damn system, the financial institutions, the politicians, the legal systems, even the media. All of it was set up to protect people like Holloway and keep people like Marcus down. One afternoon, after another long day of research, Marcus found himself sitting in the parking lot of an old diner, the neon sign buzzing above him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Tyrell calling him again. "Yo, big bro." Tyrell's voice came through, low and tight. "I need you to do me a favor. There's this dude, man. He's got my back on this hustle we're working. I'm about to come up on a big deal, but I need you to vouch for me. You know, tell him I'm good for it." Marcus sighed, looking at the screen of his phone. Tyrell always had a way of pulling him back into his mess. But Marcus couldn't leave him out there. Not when he knew how dangerous the streets could be. "I'm telling you, man," Tyrell continued, "this could change everything for me. You know I'm trying to do better, right? I just need a little help." Marcus rubbed his temples. His brother had a way of making everything sound like it was just one more step in the right direction. But Marcus knew how the game worked. Tyrell was always a step away from falling into the wrong crowd again, and Marcus had seen enough to know that sometimes helping meant getting dragged down with him. "You know better than this, Tyrell," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You've got to get out of this mess. I'm trying to build something for us, for the family, but I can't keep rescuing you every time you fall into trouble." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Tyrell spoke again, his voice was quiet. "I'm sorry, man. I know I've been messing up, but I can't do it without you." Marcus leaned back in his seat, staring up at the flickering sign. Everything in his life was getting tangled up. His brother, the bank, Holloway, the system. It was all pulling him in different directions. And the longer he stayed in this fight, the harder it became to keep his head above water. As Marcus drove home that night, the weight of it all settled in on him. There was no turning back now. He'd made too many moves, burned too many bridges. But the deeper he got, the more it felt like the odds were stacked against him. And the people who'd gotten ahead, like Holloway, like all the other fat cats, were doing everything they could to make sure people like Marcus never got a fair shot. The city was asleep, but Marcus wasn't. He couldn't sleep. Not when he knew that the next move could be the one that changed everything. He didn't have much time left to figure out how to win. But he knew this much. If he didn't push back now, if he didn't go to war with the system, the fight would never end. He just wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next. Climax. The day Marcus had been working towards had arrived, but it wasn't the clean, triumphant moment he had imagined. No, this was something else entirely, a final test. And when it hit hard. It started with a call from Alicia. She was the one who had helped him get to this point. The one who'd been in his corner when no one else was. Her voice on the phone sounded rushed, tight. Marcus had heard her upset before, but this time it was different. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling, "you need to get to the bank, now." "What's going on?" Marcus's pulse quickened. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, the feeling of dread settling in his gut like a stone. "I don't know the details, but Holloway's got his people everywhere. They know what you're up to. They're watching you." He's moved fast, Too fast, Marcus. There's talk of him shutting down your plan. He's pushing back harder than I thought. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest. The tension, the endless hours of planning and fighting, everything he'd done. This was the moment it could all crumble. But he wasn't about to let it. He couldn't, not after everything. Not after how much he'd already sacrificed. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice low, determined. When Marcus arrived at the bank, the scene was already set. The building, which had once felt like the cold, impersonal gatekeeper to the life he dreamed of, now stood in front of him like an impenetrable fortress. The sleek glass windows reflected his face back at him, tired, worn, but still determined. He took a deep breath before stepping through the door. His footsteps echoed in the marble-floored lobby. Every inch of the space screamed money. Money that he didn't have, but desperately wanted. The kind of money that kept him down. He was met by one of Holloway's men, Thomas Griffin, the head of security. Griffin was a mountain of a man, towering over Marcus, his broad shoulders and stone face sending a message that this wasn't a man who played by the rules. "You're here for the big show?" Griffin's voice was like gravel, low and threatening. He didn't even make an effort to disguise the disdain in his tone. It was the kind of disdain that said, "You're not supposed to be here." Marcus stood tall, pushing down the rising panic in his chest. "I'm here to make sure Holloway doesn't shut me down." Griffin's lips curled into a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Holloway doesn't lose. You're wasting your time." Just as Marcus was about to respond, another figure appeared from behind the large wooden doors of the main office. A man in his late 50s, dressed in an expensive suit, his face perfectly groomed. It was Holloway. George Holloway. The man who had, for all intents and purposes, built his wealth on the backs of people like Marcus. He smiled at Marcus, a smile that reeked of arrogance and disdain. "Marcus Johnson," Holloway said, his voice smooth like oil. "I must admit I didn't think you'd have the guts to show up here after all the threats. But here you are, trying to beat the system." How quaint, Marcus's fists clenched. He could feel his heart racing, the anger bubbling up in his chest like molten lava. This man had spent his entire life doing everything he could to crush people like Marcus, to shut them out of the system, to take what was rightfully theirs and keep it for himself. "You can shut me out all you want," Marcus said, his voice low but sharp. "But you're not going to stop me." "Not this time." Holloway's smile didn't falter, but there was something cold in his eyes now. "You think you're the first one to come at me like this? You think I didn't see this coming? You've been a problem for a while, Marcus. But you're just a small piece of the puzzle, and now you've made yourself a bigger target." The words stung, but they also fueled something deep inside Marcus. This wasn't just about a bank anymore. It wasn't about proving Holloway wrong. This was about survival. This was about showing the world, showing the system, that no one could keep a good man down. Not without a fight, but Holloway wasn't finished. He waved his hand dismissively, and Griffin stepped forward, blocking Marcus's way. "You've made your move. Now it's time for us to make ours." Before Marcus could react, 2 more security guards emerged from the shadows, grabbing him by the arms and pulling him toward the door. The cold metal of the cuffs clicked around his wrists, and the sharpness of the moment hit him like a punch in the gut. The sound of the cuffs felt final, like a door slamming shut in his face. "You can't do this," Marcus growled, his anger rising like a tide, but it only made them grip his arms tighter. Pushing him forward, Griffin's voice came from behind him, taunting. "Oh, we can, Marcus, we can. You never had a chance." They threw him outside, the cold wind hitting him like a slap in the face. He stumbled back, but they didn't stop. No, they kept pushing him, dragging him away from the very thing he'd been fighting for. The dream he'd spent sleepless nights building was now slipping away, just like that. His knees hit the ground, his fists clenched harder, his heart racing in his chest. He could hear the sound of his own breath, heavy and labored, and for a moment, the world felt like it was closing in on him. But then, a voice broke through the fog of his panic. It was Alicia, rushing toward him. "Marcus!" she called out. "Marcus, get up. You can't let them win!" Her words were like a lifeline, pulling him back from the brink. Marcus took a deep breath and forced himself to stand, ignoring the burning in his legs, the ache in his chest. He had to keep fighting. He wasn't going to let Holloway or anyone else push him out. Not without a fight. As the security guards moved back toward the building, Holloway's shadow loomed large in the doorway, watching him like a predator sizing up its prey. But Marcus wasn't done yet. "Not by a long shot. I'm not finished, Holloway," he shouted, his voice carrying across the empty parking lot. "You think you've won? You haven't. Not yet." Holloway stood still for a moment, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "You really think you can beat me? You're just one man, Marcus. You're nothing." But Marcus wasn't looking at Holloway anymore. He was looking at the bank. The bank that represented everything he wanted to destroy. Everything he had fought against. And in that moment, as the cold air wrapped around him and the weight of everything he'd done pressed down on his shoulders, Marcus realized something. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who'd been kept out of the system. For everyone who had been told they couldn't win, that they didn't matter. He was fighting for them all, and the fight for Marcus had only just begun. Resolution and impact. The days after Marcus's confrontation with Holloway felt like a whirlwind. Like the entire world had been flipped upside down. He'd been pushed, thrown out, mocked. Holloway and his people thought they had won. But Marcus, he wasn't done. No, the fight was only getting started. It was Alicia who helped him through the storm, pushing him to get back up when he felt like the ground had fallen away beneath him. She'd seen this before, the system pushing back, trying to break someone down for daring to stand up. But Marcus wasn't like most people. He'd been knocked down too many times in his life to stay down for long. And this was different. This wasn't just about money or a bank. It was about everything he had fought for, everything his people had fought for generations. Alicia set up a meeting with a group of activists, some of whom had ties to the financial world. They were used to fighting against the same corrupt system Marcus had encountered. They were the ones who had been knocking on doors and raising hell long before he came along. They told him what he needed to do next, how to bring Holloway down, how to expose the corruption that ran so deep no one wanted to talk about it. They didn't have to convince Marcus. He already knew the score. For the next few weeks, Marcus and his new allies worked in the shadows. They gathered information, made connections, and pushed back against the people who'd been running the show for far too long. But it wasn't just about the bank anymore. It was about dismantling a system that had kept people of color out for years. It was about rewriting the rules, about showing the world that someone who came from nothing could take on the big dogs and win, and that's exactly what they did. They gathered enough evidence to expose Holloway's shady dealings, his political influence, his under-the-table deals, the way he'd been using his wealth to manipulate the system. It was a full-on expose. When the news hit, it spread like wildfire. Holloway's empire began to crumble. His supporters, his partners, the people who had propped him up, all of them turned on him when the truth came to light. For the first time in years, the bank's doors were forced open, not to welcome him in, but to finally open the floodgates for change. Holloway was arrested, his wealth seized, and the bank was sold. It wasn't just a victory for Marcus. It was a victory for everyone who had been shut out by the same system, for every person who had been told their dreams were too big, too impossible. For every black person who'd been told they didn't belong. But Marcus knew it wasn't over. Winning this battle was just the beginning. He didn't just want to tear the system down. He wanted to build something new, something that would be built for people like him, for the underdogs who never had a chance, but fought anyway. One quiet evening, as Marcus sat in his modest apartment, staring at the stacks of papers and the emails from the lawyers, he reflected on everything that had led up to this moment. He thought about the way people had treated him, how they'd looked down on him, dismissed him, and tried to shut him out. He thought about his brother Terrell, who had never fully believed in the dream Marcus was chasing, but still followed in his footsteps. Tyrell wasn't there yet, but Marcus knew it was just a matter of time before his brother saw what he had been working for. He had to keep pushing. It wasn't just about success anymore. It was about legacy. It was about creating something that would outlive him, that would change the world for his kids, for his community, for anyone who came after him. Marcus wasn't a revolutionary. He wasn't a political activist by trade. He was just a guy who had been treated like he didn't matter, until he decided to make sure he did. Until he realized that in a world built to exclude, the most powerful thing you could do was demand to be seen. As he sat there, the weight of it all finally sank in. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the whole damn system to change. For the people who had always been left behind. For the ones who had fought for freedom and equality and never got the chance to truly taste it. And as the days went on, Marcus began to realize that this was more than just a fight for financial equality. It was a fight for human dignity, for respect, for the right to live without fear, without barriers, without limits. But even as he looked at the news coverage and saw the ripple effects of what had happened, Marcus knew there was still so much work left to do. The system hadn't changed overnight. The fight wasn't over. Holloway's arrest was just one chapter in a much bigger story. The financial system, the political system, it was all still rigged. The world still had a long way to go before it would treat everyone equally. Marcus stood up, the weight of the future on his shoulders. He wasn't done yet. How long are we going to let this go on? The question hung in the air. It was haunting. It was a question that needed to be asked because it couldn't just be one victory, one step forward. The question needed to spark something, ignite the fire in those who still had a seat at the table, those who were still afraid to speak up, to stand out. How long were they going to let the system keep pushing people down, making them feel like their dreams didn't matter? The truth was, no one had the answers. But Marcus wasn't afraid to ask the question. He was ready for the next fight, and this time, he wasn't alone.